Warning: this story contains extreme violence, slasher elements, and murder. I encourage you to listen to the entire story, and if you enjoy this type of content, please subscribe and press the bell icon to stay updated. It was an isolated stretch of asphalt that seemed to slice through the heart of nowhere. The highway was long forgotten, a relic of an era when it had once been the main route between small towns that had since faded into obscurity. Over the years, it had become infamous for accidents and disappearances, but no one ever truly knew why. The locals would whisper tales of a cursed road, warning travelers to take the long way around. Ben had heard none of these stories. A seasoned truck driver, he prided himself on taking the most efficient routes, and that night, he was already running late. The sun had set hours ago, and the chill of the desert air seeped into his cab. His headlights cut through the endless darkness as he drove down the desolate highway, the radio crackling with static. He barely noticed the sign he passed, worn and faded, but its message was clear: proceed at your own risk. His first hint that something was wrong came when his engine sputtered. He cursed, thumping the steering wheel in frustration. The truck shuddered, and then, as if surrendering to some unseen force, the engine died completely. Silence. The highway stretched before him, an endless void. He tried the ignition again and again, but it was no use. Ben sat back, exhaling a cloud of fog into the cold night air. He glanced at his phone. No signal. Of course. With a grunt, he grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the truck. The cold bit into his skin, and a strange feeling washed over him, an unsettling quiet that seemed far too heavy for the surroundings. That's when he saw her. At first, she was just a silhouette at the edge of his headlights, standing motionless by the roadside. Ben squinted, shining his flashlight toward her. A woman, slender and dressed in a long, flowing white dress. Her hair hung in dark waves over her shoulders, and her face was downturned as though she were crying. "Hey!" Ben called out. Move, didn't respond. Something about her posture made his stomach churn, but his instincts told him to help. He approached cautiously, the gravel crunching under his boots. "Are you okay?" he asked again, his voice wavering. The closer he got, the colder the air became, an unnatural chill that seeped into his bones. She lifted her head slowly, and Ben stopped dead in his tracks, her eyes. They were wide, too wide, and filled with an unbearable sadness. But more than that, they glowed, faintly at first, then brighter, like cold embers burning in the dark. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her lips parted slightly as though she were about to speak. But no words came. Only the whisper of wind and the distant hum of his truck's cooling engine. Ben's breath caught in his throat as a wave of dread washed over him. He couldn't move, couldn't tear his gaze away from her. The sorrow in her eyes pulled at him, dragging him deeper into a well of despair he couldn't understand. And then, she smiled. It was a slow, creeping smile that spread across her face, twisting her sorrow into something far darker. The air around her began to shimmer, and the ground beneath Ben's feet shifted as if the earth itself were recoiling from her presence. He took a step back, but it was too late. Her hand shot out, cold and bony, grabbing his wrist with a grip like iron. Her touch was freezing, burning his skin with a cold that felt like death itself. Ben tried to scream, but no sound came out. The world around him twisted and distorted, the sky turning black, the stars vanishing. The highway, the truck, everything was swallowed by the darkness, and in that darkness, he heard them, the screams. Faint at first, but growing louder, more frantic. Screams of terror, of pain, of agony. The sound of countless voices all crying out in unison. Ben's vision blurred, and he felt himself being dragged into the void, into her world. He fought, but her face was the last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him, her smile stretching impossibly wide, her eyes burning with cruel delight. Then, nothing. The highway claimed another life that night. Ben's truck was found the next day, abandoned by the roadside. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass. Just an empty cab and a set of skid marks leading into the ditch. The police searched the area, combing through the desert for miles, but there was no trace of him. He had simply vanished, like so many before him. The locals knew better than to investigate too closely. They had heard the stories, passed down through generations. Stories of a woman, a ghost who haunted the old highway, preying on those foolish enough to cross her path. Some said she was the spirit of a woman who had been killed in a car accident decades ago, her body never found. Others claimed she was a hitchhiker, murdered and left to die in the desert, her soul forever bound to the road. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could imagine. Amy had never believed in ghost stories. As a journalist for a small online publication, she thrived on debunking urban legends and exposing the truth behind local folklore. So when she heard about the mysterious disappearances along the old highway, she saw it as the perfect opportunity to uncover another hoax. Armed with her camera, a notebook, and a stubborn sense of skepticism, she set out to investigate. The drive was uneventful at first. The highway stretched endlessly before her, a barren strip of asphalt cutting through the desolate landscape. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert. Amy drove with a sense of determination, her mind already piecing together the article she would write. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, something changed. The air grew colder, and the sky darkened, which had been playing softly in the background, suddenly crackled with static before going silent. Amy frowned, glancing at the dashboard. Everything seemed fine, but there was an unsettling heaviness in the air, a tension that made her grip the steering wheel tighter. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw her, a woman, standing by the roadside, her figure barely visible in the dim light. Amy slowed the car, her heart skipping a beat. The woman was dressed in a long white gown, her dark hair hanging loose around her face. She was standing perfectly still, her head bowed, as though waiting for something. Amy hesitated. The logical part of her mind told her to keep driving, but her instincts as a journalist urged her to investigate. She pulled the car to a stop a few feet away from the woman and rolled down the window. "Do you need help?" Amy called out, her voice echoing in the stillness. The woman didn't respond. Amy's hand hovered over her phone, debating whether to call the police. But something about the woman's stillness unnerved her. She stepped out of the car, her breath visible in the cold night air, and approached cautiously. "Are you okay?" Amy asked again, her voice softer now. The woman lifted her head slowly, and Amy's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes, they were wrong. Too wide, too bright. And the sorrow in them, it was unbearable. A sadness so deep it seemed to pull at Amy's very soul. For a moment, Amy stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to run, to get back in the car and drive away as fast as she could. But something held her in place. Something in the woman's eyes. Then the woman smiled. It was a smile that sent a jolt of fear through Amy's body, a smile that twisted the woman's sorrow into something monstrous. The air around her seemed to shimmer, and the smell of decay filled Amy's night. Stumbling back, but the woman's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with a grip like ice. Amy screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The world around her twisted and distorted, the highway vanishing into the void. And in that void, Amy heard the screams. They echoed all around her, growing louder, more frantic. The screams of the lost, the tortured, the damned, and Amy knew, with a sickening certainty, that she had become one of them. They say the highway is cursed, that it takes those who dare to travel its forsaken path. The locals know better than to venture there after dark, for the ghostly woman still haunts the road, waiting for her next victim. Some say she was once a woman, a victim of tragedy, her soul bound to the highway for eternity. Others believe she is something far older, far more sinister, a demon in the guise of a sorrowful spirit, luring the unsuspecting into her world of torment. But the truth is far more terrifying than any legend, for those who vanish on the highway are not simply lost. They are taken, dragged into a dark and twisted realm where the woman reigns supreme. A realm of endless torment, where the screams of the damned echo through the void, and there is no escape, and she waits, always, for the next traveler to cross her, spiraled into madness. The moment the woman's icy hand gripped her wrist, it felt like every fiber of her being was torn from reality and plunged into a nightmarish limbo. She could no longer see the road, the desert, or even her car. Instead, she found herself standing in a twisted version of the highway, a barren, shadowy wasteland that stretched into eternity. The sky was pitch black, devoid of stars or moonlight. The only illumination came from the flickering headlights of long-abandoned cars scattered along the road, ghostly remnants of travelers who had met the same fate as she was about to. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a stench so vile that Amy gagged, bile rising in her throat. She stumbled forward, her legs weak, her mind reeling from the overwhelming terror that gripped her. Behind her, the woman still stood, her smile widening, impossibly, until her face twisted into a grotesque parody of human expression. The sorrow was gone, replaced by a sinister hunger that radiated from her in waves. Her eyes, once mournful, now burned with malevolent glee as she whispered in a voice that echoed from all directions at once, "You'll never leave. You'll stay here, like the others." Forever. Amy's heart pounded in her chest, the realization of her doom crashing down on her. The ground beneath her feet shifted, the asphalt cracking and giving way to a black, bubbling substance that oozed out like molten tar. Hands, skeletal, blood-soaked hands, reached up from the cracks, clawing at her ankles, dragging her deeper into the suffocating darkness. She screamed. A scream so primal, so filled with fear, that it felt as though her soul was being ripped apart. But her scream was swallowed by the darkness, just as the others had been. Desperate, Amy kicked at the hands, struggling to free herself, but more emerged from the ground, grasped the lost souls of the highway, those who had been taken by the ghostly woman, their bodies left behind but their spirits trapped here, doomed to suffer for eternity. Their faces emerged from the bubbling tar, eyes wide with terror, mouths stretched open in silent agony as they reached for her, their fingers digging into her skin, tearing at her flesh. Blood flowed freely from the wounds they inflicted, soaking her clothes, staining the ground beneath her. The pain was excruciating, but it paled in comparison to the horror of what was happening to her mind. She could feel it slipping away, piece by piece, consumed by the madness of this cursed place. She wasn't going to let it happen. Not without a fight, Amy thrashed violently, pulling her legs free from the grasping hands, and stumbled forward, gasping for breath. The ground beneath her shifted again, but she kept running, her eyes darting around wildly, searching for an escape. But there was none. The twisted highway stretched on forever, and a ghostly woman's laughter echoed behind her, growing louder, more deranged with every step. "You can't run from me," the woman hissed, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "This is my road." Amy's legs burned as she pushed herself further into the nightmarish landscape, her blood leaving a trail on the cracked asphalt. The shadows seemed to move with her, growing thicker, more oppressive, as if the darkness itself was alive and hungry for her suffering. Suddenly, she saw it, a light in the distance. Faint but unmistakable, flickering like a beacon of hope. Her heart leaped, and she forced her battered body to move faster. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it was her only chance. The ghostly woman's voice screamed after her, filled with rage. "You can't escape. You belong to me." Amy didn't stop. She ran toward the light, her legs weak, her vision blurring from souls filled her ears, their tortured faces flashing in the corners of her vision, but she didn't look back. She couldn't. As she neared the light, the air around her grew colder, the stench of decay stronger. The light wasn't salvation, it was something far worse. Amy's steps faltered, dread clawing at her chest, but it was too late to stop. The light wasn't a beacon. It was a doorway. It stood in the middle of the road, an archway of rotting wood and twisted metal, glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. Beyond it, there was nothing. Just a void. A swirling mass of darkness and horror that defied comprehension. Amy stumbled to a halt, her heart racing. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn around, but the pull of the void was irresistible. Before she could decide what to do, the ground beneath her split open once more, and more hands shot up, grabbing her legs, pulling her toward the doorway. The ghostly woman appeared behind her, moving with inhuman speed, her smile widening, her laughter echoing through the night. Amy fought, kicking at the hands, screaming for help, but there was no one. No one except the woman, whose laughter grew louder, more insane with each passing second. "You're mine," the woman whispered, her cold breath brushing against Amy's ear. "You'll join the others. You'll suffer like they do." The hands pulled harder, dragging Amy closer to the doorway. The closer she got, the more she could hear it. Screams. Thousands of screams. The tortured voices of those who had been taken before her, their souls trapped in a void, forever screaming, forever suffering. Amy's mind shattered. Her body was pulled into the archway, her blood-soaked form disappearing into the swirling darkness. The last thing she saw was the woman's twisted smile, her eyes glowing with satisfaction, as Amy was dragged into the void, her screams joining the chorus. Was found on the side of the highway, just like Ben's. The engine was still warm, the doors locked, but there was no sign of her. No blood, no broken glass. Nothing. Her disappearance made headlines for a few days, but like all the others before her, she was soon forgotten. The highway remained empty, silent, a dark scar cutting through the desert. The locals knew better than to travel it at night. They had heard the screams, seen the empty cars, and they knew the truth. The ghostly woman still haunted the road, waiting for her next victim. Her sorrowful eyes luring them in, her smile sealing their fate. And once they entered her world, there was no escape. Only endless suffering, endless screams, and a void that swallowed everything. And so the highway continued to claim lives, one by one, as the legend grew. Some say the woman was once a victim herself, trapped by forces beyond her control. Others believe she was something far worse, an ancient evil, feeding off the souls of the living. But no one knows for sure. What they do know is this: If you see her, if you hear her whispers, if you feel the chill in the air, you're already too late. She has chosen you. And on the highway, there is no escape. Turned into weeks, but Amy's disappearance wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The local sheriff, Hank Mason, had seen enough strange disappearances to last a lifetime. A veteran cop with a rough demeanor, Hank didn't believe in ghosts or curses. But something about Amy's case got under his skin. Maybe it was the sheer volume of disappearances that always occurred on that stretch of highway, or maybe it was the way her car had been found, perfectly intact, with no sign of struggle or foul play. Just gone. Hank had read Amy's articles before. She was sharp, never the type to fall for local folklore, and always skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained rationally. The fact that she had vanished made him wonder if there was more to the highway than just bad luck. Against his better judgment, Hank decided to investigate. It was late evening when Hank finally reached the cursed stretch of road. His patrol car hummed as it rolled down the old highway, the dim glow of his headlights barely cutting through the thick fog that clung to the asphalt like a shroud. The wind howled across the empty plains, a low, mournful sound that sent a chill down his spine. As the minutes passed, Hank's unease grew. The road seemed endless, stretching out like a black ribbon into the unknown. He glanced at the dashboard clock. It flickered, the numbers scrambling for a moment before settling back into place. Static hissed from the radio, and the temperature inside the car seemed to drop several degrees. "Damn it," Hank muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Suddenly, his headlights caught something on the side of the road, a figure standing in the distance, motionless. At first, it looked like a trick of the fog, but as he drew closer, Hank could make out the shape of a woman, her pale skin almost glowing in the darkness. She stood there, her head bowed, her long white dress billowing slightly in the ghostly woman from the stories. Hank felt his heart hammer in his chest. Every rational part of his mind told him to turn around and drive away as fast as he could, but something else, something deeper, more primal, urged him forward. He had to see for himself. He had to know. He stopped the car a few feet away from the woman and rolled down the window. "You need help?" Hank called out, his voice steady despite the growing fear gnawing at him. The woman didn't move. Didn't even flinch. Hank cursed under his breath and stepped out of the car. The moment his boots touched the asphalt, a wave of cold swept over him, colder than any night he'd ever experienced. His breath came out in short, foggy bursts as he approached the woman. "I'm the sheriff," Hank said, his voice louder now. "You all right?" The woman's head lifted slowly, and Hank's blood ran cold. Her eyes, those glowing, sorrowful eyes, pierced the darkness, locking onto his with a gaze that was both pitiful and terrifying. Her face was deathly pale, her lips parted as if she were about to speak, but no words came. "Jesus," Hank muttered, taking a step back. His hand instinctively went to the holster at his side, though he knew deep down that no gun could protect him from whatever this was. Without warning, the woman's expression changed. Her sorrow twisted into a cruel smile, and her eyes burned brighter, unnatural, malevolent. The air around them grew impossibly cold, and the fog thickened, swirling like a living thing, and then she moved. Her feet didn't touch the ground. She floated toward him, her body gliding through the air with an unnatural grace. Hank backed away, heart pounding, but his legs felt heavy, like they were rooted to the spot. The woman's smile widened, stretching across her face in a way that no human smile ever could. Her eyes locked onto his, and Hank felt something deep within him, something primal and instinctual, telling him to run. Frozen, trapped by her gaze. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice like a distant echo, barely more than a breath. Hank's vision blurred, the world around him fading into shadows and swirling fog. His body trembled, the icy cold sinking deep into his bones. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His breath hitched as he felt something invisible, something dark, wrapping around him, pulling him closer to her. The closer she came, the more his skin burned with an icy pain that felt like frostbite, like death itself was touching him, and then, just as suddenly, it stopped, the fog lifted. The cold receded. The highway returned to normal, and the woman was gone. Hank collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. His body was drenched in sweat, his heart racing, but the ghostly woman had disappeared as if she had never been there at all. For a moment, he thought it had been a hallucination, a product of his overactive imagination. But when he looked down at his hands, he saw the frostbite marks, his skin burned black in places where she had touched him. Panting heavily, Hank struggled to his feet and staggered back to his patrol car. His hands were shaking as he fumbled for the keys and started the engine. He didn't care about the investigation anymore. He didn't care about finding answers. He just needed to get the hell away from that place. But as he drove back down the highway, he realized something horrifying. He wasn't alone. In the rearview mirror, he saw her again, sitting in the back seat, her glowing eyes watching him with that same twisted smile. His blood turned to ice, his grip on the steering wheel tightening as terror gripped him. The radio crackled to life, and over the static, Hank heard the distant, tortured screams of the lost souls who had traveled this road before him. "Please. No," he whispered, his voice trembling. But it was too late. The woman leaned forward, her cold breath brushing against his ear as she backed to town. His patrol car was found abandoned on the side of the highway, the engine still running, the doors locked, and no sign of the sheriff. Just like all the others, his disappearance sent shockwaves through the community. The people who had once whispered about the cursed highway now spoke openly of the danger it posed, warning travelers to avoid it at all costs. But for some, the allure of the mystery was too strong to resist. The highway remained desolate, a forbidden stretch of road that no one dared to cross at night. Yet, those brave, or foolish, enough to drive down it could still feel the cold wind, still hear the faint echoes of screams carried on the breeze. And if they listened closely, they might see her, a pale figure in white, standing by the side of the road, her sorrowful eyes glowing in the darkness. Some say that the highway is a portal to another realm, a place where lost souls are trapped for eternity. Others believe the woman is the embodiment of the road itself, a vengeful spirit feeding on the lives of those who dare to cross her path, but no one knows for sure. All they know is that the highway is haunted. And once you've seen her, once you've felt her icy grip on your soul, there's no escaping her. You're hers forever. Months after Hank's disappearance, a young man named Ryan decided to test his luck. A thrill seeker by nature, Ryan didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or urban legends. He had heard the stories about the haunted highway, but to him, they were nothing more than campfire tales meant to scare the weak-minded. One cold night, he got in his car and drove out to the old highway, determined to prove once and for all that there was no such thing as the supernatural. The road stretched out before him, dark and empty, the only sound the hum of his engine. For miles, there was nothing. No ghostly woman, no eerie fog. Just endless asphalt. He smirked to himself, shaking his head at the absurdity of it all. Figures, he muttered, but just as he was about to turn around and head home, he saw her, standing in the middle of the road, her long white dress billowing in the wind, her glowing eyes fixed on him. Ryan slammed on the brakes, his heart leaping into his throat. The car skidded to a stop just inches from her, the tires screeching against the pavement. He stared at her in disbelief, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the woman raised her hand and pointed directly at him, her lips curling into that same twisted smile. Ryan's blood ran cold. He floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning as the car lurched forward. The woman didn't move, didn't even flinch. As the car passed through her, her body dissolving into mist as it disappeared behind him, Ryan's heart raced as he sped down the highway, his mind reeling from what he had just seen. But when he glanced in the rearview mirror, his stomach dropped. She was there, sitting in the back seat, her eyes glowing with malice.